Before and After Enlightenment, How Perception Changes When Resistance Falls Away, by David Rousseau. Right now, as you're listening, there may be a quiet sense that something isn't quite right. Maybe nothing is obviously wrong, but there's a subtle tension, a background pressure, a feeling that you should be somewhere else, doing something else, becoming something more. That feeling is so familiar, it barely stands out, but it shapes everything: how you think, how you act, how you experience your life. Most people never question it. They assume it's just part of being human, but it isn't. It's what it feels like to live in resistance. And what's surprising is how different everything becomes when that resistance falls away. Introduction. This isn't a book about becoming something new. It's about seeing something that's already here. Something so constant, so familiar, that it's almost invisible. Most of us move through life with a quiet sense of friction, a subtle tension in the background of our experience, a feeling that something needs to change, improve, or resolve before we can finally relax. Sometimes it's loud stress, frustration, overthinking. Other times it's barely noticeable, just a low hum of unease. But it's almost always there, and because it's always there, we rarely question it. We assume it's caused by life itself, by circumstances, other people, or the uncertainty of the future. So, we try to manage those things. We try to fix, control, and rearrange the outside world, hoping that, eventually, the tension inside will disappear. But what if that tension isn't coming from life? What if it's coming from resistance to life? A subtle, automatic habit of pushing against what's already happening. This book explores what happens when that resistance begins to loosen, not as a belief, not as a philosophy, but as a direct shift in perception, because when resistance falls away, even briefly, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't necessarily change. Your life circumstances may look exactly the same, but the way those circumstances are experienced, the way each moment feels, becomes fundamentally different. This difference is often described as clarity, presence, or even peace. But those words can be misleading. They make it sound distant, rare, or difficult to reach. In reality, it's something much simpler. It's what remains when the constant effort to resist, control, and reinterpret life begins to fade. Throughout this book, we'll explore that shift from multiple angles. We'll look at what life feels like under resistance, how it shapes perception, behavior, and identity. We'll examine the subtle ways this resistance operates, often unnoticed, and we'll move, step by step, into what changes when it begins to dissolve, not as a final destination, not as a perfect state, but as an ongoing way of experiencing life with less friction and more clarity. You won't be asked to adopt new beliefs. You won't need to force yourself into a different way of thinking. Instead, you'll be invited to notice, to observe your own experience closely enough that certain patterns become clear on their own, because once seen clearly, some things no longer need to be changed. They simply fall away, and what remains is not something new, but something that was always there, waiting to be recognized. Chapter 1. Life under Resistance. Before any shift in perception, before clarity, or presence, or anything that might be called awakening, there is a way of experiencing life that feels completely normal. So normal, in fact, that it rarely comes into question. It feels like you. It feels like reality. And at the center of it is a subtle, persistent habit. Resistance. Not always dramatic, not always obvious. Often, it appears as something practical, planning, evaluating, improving, fixing. But underneath those activities, there is usually a quiet assumption. This moment is not quite enough as it is. Something needs to change. Something needs to be added, removed, or rearranged before things can feel right. You might notice this in small ways. Reaching for your phone without thinking, mentally replaying a conversation that already ended, anticipating what comes next instead of fully being where you are. Even in moments that are supposed to be restful, the mind keeps moving, adjusting, comparing, commenting. There is a constant leaning away from what is, toward what could be better. This leaning creates tension, not always intense tension. Often it's just a faint tightness in the body, a slight contraction in the mind. But over time, it becomes the baseline. It becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like tension. It feels like life. From within this state, perception is shaped in a very specific way. Situations are quickly labeled, good or bad, success or failure, progress or setback, and once labeled, they are reacted to. Something good is held on to, extended, worried over. Something bad is resisted, avoided, or mentally replayed. Very little is simply allowed to be as it is. Instead, experience is filtered through a constant process of evaluation. What does this mean for me? How does this affect my future? What should I do about it? This creates a sense that life is something to manage, something to stay on top of, something that can go wrong if not handled correctly, and so attention becomes narrowly focused, not on the present moment itself, but on what the present moment represents. A conversation becomes a test, a delay becomes a problem, uncertainty becomes something to resolve as quickly as possible. Even neutral moments are rarely neutral for long. They are filled with interpretation. This is life under resistance. It is not necessarily chaotic or dramatic. In fact, it often looks functional from the outside. People still work, plan, achieve, and maintain relationships. But internally, there is effort, a continuous, often unnoticed effort, to shape experience into something more comfortable, more predictable, more secure. And because this effort is constant, there is very little rest. Even when nothing is happening, the mind continues its activity, thinking about what was, preparing for what might be, adjusting an internal version of reality that never quite settles. Over time, this creates a quiet sense of dissatisfaction, not always strong enough to name, but present enough to influence everything. The sense that something is missing, or not yet resolved, or just out of reach. And so the search begins. Sometimes it looks like ambition, sometimes self-improvement, sometimes distraction. But underneath all of it is the same movement, away from what is, toward what might finally feel complete. What often goes unnoticed is that this movement itself is part of the tension. The very effort to escape discomfort is what sustains it. The constant attempt to arrive somewhere else prevents any real sense of arrival. But this is not something that needs to be believed. It can be observed. Right now, if you pause for a moment, you may begin to notice it directly. A slight impatience, a subtle mental pull toward the next thing, an urge to adjust, interpret, or move away from what is already here. This is resistance in its simplest form, not a flaw, not a mistake, just a learned pattern of relating to experience. And like any pattern, it continues mostly because it goes unseen. The purpose of this chapter is not to eliminate it, not to replace it with something better, only to begin to notice it. Because the moment resistance is clearly seen, even briefly, something begins to shift, not through effort, not through control, but through simple awareness. And that shift, small, quiet, almost unremarkable, is where everything that follows begins. Chapter 2. The Masks We Wear. As resistance begins to come into view, something else starts to reveal itself alongside it. A structure, a sense of who you are, that feels solid, continuous, and real. But when looked at more closely, it isn't as fixed as it seems. It shifts depending on the situation. At work, you may become focused, responsible, driven. With friends, more relaxed, expressive, open. In conflict, perhaps defensive or guarded. Alone, something quieter, harder to define. Each of these versions feels like me in the moment, and yet, they are not the same. They are roles, subtle, automatic ways of presenting yourself to the world and to your own thoughts. These roles are not inherently a problem. They are functional. They help you navigate different environments, but without realizing it, they begin to harden into identity. Not just something you do, but something you believe you are. I'm the kind of person who, I always, I never. These quiet statements form a framework through which experience is interpreted, and once that framework is in place, perception begins to organize itself around it. You don't just experience life. You experience life as someone with a past, someone moving toward a future, someone who needs to maintain a certain image, avoid certain outcomes, and protect a sense of self. This is where resistance becomes more subtle. Because now, it's not just about situations, it's about identity. If something challenges the image you hold of yourself, there is a reaction, a need to defend, to explain, to reinterpret what happened. If something supports that image, there is a different reaction, a desire to hold onto it, repeat it, strengthen it. In both cases, experience is no longer seen clearly. It is filtered, shaped to fit an internal narrative about who you are and how life should unfold. Most of this happens automatically. There is no conscious decision to create a self. It forms gradually, through memory, habit, and repetition. Moments are remembered, patterns are recognized, conclusions are drawn, and over time, those conclusions solidify into identity. But here's what often goes unnoticed. This identity is not stable. It requires constant maintenance. It depends on thought, on ongoing mental activity to keep it in place. Without that activity, even briefly, the sense of a fix me begins to soften. You may have already experienced this, without realizing what it was. A moment of complete absorption, in music, in nature, in a simple task, where the usual sense of self fades into the background. For a moment, there is no need to be anyone in particular, no image to uphold, no role to play, just direct experience. And in those moments, there is often a sense of ease, not because anything has been added, but because something has fallen away. This points to something important. Much of what feels like you is not a fixed reality, but an ongoing construction. And because it is constructed, it can also be seen, not analyzed, not judged, simply noticed as it forms. You might begin to observe this in real time. A comment from someone, and an immediate internal response. That's not fair. They don't understand me. I need to explain. Notice how quickly the sense of self organizes around the moment, how it creates a position, a perspective, a subtle boundary between me and this. And along with that boundary comes tension, a need to protect, adjust, or reinforce what has just been formed. This is another layer of resistance, more refined, more hidden, because now, it doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like being yourself, but the more closely it is observed, the more fluid it becomes. You begin to see that identity is not something you are. It is something that appears, something that forms in response to conditions, and dissolves when those conditions are no longer active. This doesn't mean you lose the ability to function. You can still speak, decide, act, and relate, but the sense of being tightly defined begins to loosen, and with that loosening, a different kind of perception becomes possible, less filtered, less reactive, less tied to maintaining a particular image. This is not a dramatic shift. It happens gradually, through simple observation, seeing the masks as they arise, not trying to remove them, just recognizing that they are masks, because once something is clearly seen as a role, it no longer has the same weight. It can still appear, but it doesn't need to be defended in the same way. And in that small change, resistance begins to lose one of its strongest supports, not through effort, but through understanding. And as that understanding deepens, the space between who you think you are and what you actually experience begins to open, quietly, naturally, without force. Chapter 3. The Cost of Fighting Life. By the time resistance and identity have taken shape, they no longer feel like patterns. They feel like necessity. It seems obvious that you should think things through, that you should anticipate problems, that you should avoid discomfort and move toward what feels better. From this perspective, resistance doesn't appear as resistance at all. It appears as intelligence, as responsibility, as the way to stay in control of your life. And yet, beneath that appearance, there is a cost, not always dramatic, not always visible from the outside, but steady, accumulating. You can begin to notice it in the simplest loops. A thought arises about something you need to do. Almost immediately, another thought follows, questioning it, adjusting it, adding pressure to it. I should do this. What if I don't do it well? I need to get it right. I'll start soon. The mind circles. What could have been a simple action becomes layered with hesitation. That hesitation creates tension, and that tension makes the action feel heavier than it is. So it's delayed, or avoided, and later, that delay becomes something else to think about. Regret, self-criticism, renewed pressure. A loop begins to form, not because the situation is complex, but because resistance has entered the process. The same pattern appears in relationships. A small comment is made, neutral, perhaps even insignificant, but it is heard through the filter of identity, interpreted, expanded. What did they mean by that? Was that criticism? Do I need to respond? Instead of passing naturally, the moment is held in place by thought, revisited, analyzed, given weight it may not have had otherwise, and the longer it is held, the more real it begins to feel. What started as a simple interaction becomes a source of tension, not because of what happened, but because of the ongoing effort to resolve it mentally. This is how resistance quietly shapes experience. It doesn't just react to life, it extends it. It takes brief moments and turns them into ongoing psychological events. And in doing so, it creates a sense that life is heavier than it actually is, more complicated, more demanding. Over time, this has broader effects. Decision-making becomes slower, not because options are unclear, but because each option is weighed against an internal standard. What is the right choice? What will this lead to? What does this say about me? Instead of responding directly, there is a layer of mental negotiation, trying to eliminate uncertainty, trying to guarantee outcomes. But certainty rarely comes, so the mind keeps working, and working, even when no solution is found. This constant activity creates fatigue, not just physical fatigue, but cognitive and emotional strain, a sense of always being on, even in moments meant for rest. You may notice this at the end of the day. The body is still, the environment is quiet, but the mind continues, replaying conversations, projecting into tomorrow, adjusting, correcting, anticipating, as if stopping would risk something being missed, something going wrong. This is the cost of trying to control experience from the inside. The assumption is that more thought leads to better outcomes, but often, it leads to more tension, more second-guessing, more distance from direct action. And beneath all of this is a deeper effect that is easy to overlook. Perception itself becomes distorted, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle, consistent bias. Attention is drawn toward what is unresolved, what is lacking, what could go wrong. Even in positive situations, the mind searches for what needs to be maintained or protected. Very little is simply experienced, without being turned into something to manage. This creates a quiet sense of incompleteness, as if something is always unfinished, always in need of adjustment, and because of that, there is a constant movement toward the future, toward a moment when everything will finally feel settled. But that moment rarely arrives, because the habit of resistance does not end when circumstances improve. It continues, finding new things to adjust, new situations to evaluate, new reasons to stay mentally engaged. So the search continues, not necessarily for something specific, but for a feeling of resolution that seems just out of reach. This is where a subtle realization begins to form, not as an idea, but as an observation, that the effort to fix experience may be contributing to the very tension it's trying to resolve, that the constant movement away from what is prevents any real sense of ease, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the problem is not life itself, but the way it is being met. This realization doesn't immediately change anything. The patterns are still there, the habits still operate, but something has been seen, a connection between resistance and strain, between control and tension, and once that connection is noticed, even briefly, it becomes harder to ignore. The loops may continue, but now, they are visible, not as facts, not as necessary processes, but as patterns. And in seeing them as patterns, a question begins to emerge, a simple one. What would happen if, even for a moment, nothing needed to be changed, not answered, not improved, not resolved, just experienced? That question doesn't demand a response. It opens a possibility, a small gap, in the movement of the mind. And in that gap, something different can begin to appear, not through effort, but through the absence of it. And that is where the shift begins. Chapter 4. Noticing the shift. The shift doesn't begin as a conclusion. It doesn't arrive with certainty, or announce itself as something important. In fact, it's easy to miss, because at first, it doesn't look like much. There is no dramatic change in the outside world, no sudden transformation of circumstances. What changes is subtler than that. It appears as a small interruption in the usual patterns, a moment where the mind, instead of immediately reacting, pauses, not forced, not controlled, just a gap. You might notice it in the middle of a familiar loop. A thought begins to form, something you've thought many times before, but this time, before it fully takes hold, there is a brief awareness of it, as if you are seeing the thought at the same time it is arising, and in that seeing, something is different. The thought may still continue, the reaction may still follow, but it is no longer completely automatic. There is a hint of space. Comma. This is often how the shift begins, not as a permanent state, but as a series of small, quiet recognitions, moments where experience is seen, instead of immediately acted upon. You might notice it while listening to someone speak. Normally, there is a tendency to prepare a response, to agree, disagree, interpret, compare. But for a moment, that movement softens. Comma, and instead of listening through thought, there is just listening, clear, direct, unfiltered. No need to add anything. Or you might notice it in a moment of discomfort. A feeling arises, restlessness, frustration, uncertainty. The usual impulse is to move away from it, to distract, fix, or resolve. But this time, there is a pause. The feeling is still there, but instead of immediately reacting to it, it is simply noticed, felt, without explanation, and something unexpected happens. It shifts, not because it was changed, but because it was allowed. These moments are easy to overlook, because they don't fit the usual idea of progress. Nothing is achieved, nothing is gained. If anything, less is happening. And yet, there is a different quality to experience, a sense of ease that isn't dependent on circumstances, a clarity that doesn't come from thinking more, but from thinking less. At this stage, it's common for the mind to try to understand what's happening, to label it, to hold on to it, to repeat it. How do I get back to that? What did I do differently? How can I make this last? But these questions, though natural, pull attention back into the old pattern, back into effort, back into control, because the shift isn't something that can be produced. It doesn't come from doing more. It appears when something unnecessary is no longer being done, when resistance, even briefly, is not present. This is why curiosity becomes more useful than control. Instead of trying to recreate the experience, you begin to notice when it happens naturally what was different in that moment, not as a strategy, but as an observation. Often, the difference is simple. There was less interference, less commentary, less urgency to change what was happening, just a quiet allowing, and in that allowing, perception clears. Things are seen more directly, not through layers of interpretation, but as they are. This doesn't mean thoughts disappear. They continue to arise, but they are lighter, less convincing. They don't carry the same immediate authority. You may begin to notice that a thought is just a thought, a mental event, not a command, not a fact. And in seeing that, there is more freedom in how you respond, not because you are controlling your reactions, but because you are no longer fully identified with them. This stage can feel inconsistent, clear one moment, caught in patterns the next, open and present, then suddenly lost in thought again. This fluctuation is natural. It doesn't mean the shift is failing. It means it is being seen. Each time awareness returns, even after being lost, the pattern becomes more familiar, more recognizable, and over time, this recognition deepens, not through effort, but through repetition of seeing. You begin to trust the simplicity of it, that nothing special needs to happen, that clarity is not something distant or rare. It is what remains when the constant movement of resistance pauses, even briefly, and in those brief moments, a different way of experiencing life becomes visible, not as an idea, but as something direct, something immediate, something quietly available, here and now, whenever the effort to be somewhere else falls away. Chapter 5. Surrender and Acceptance. At some point, as these small shifts are noticed, a question naturally begins to form. If resistance creates tension, what happens when it is no longer there, not as an idea, but in direct experience? This is where the words surrender and acceptance often appear, and just as often, they are misunderstood because they can sound like passivity, like giving up, like allowing life to happen without response or direction. But that is not what is being pointed to here. Surrender is not about what you do externally, it is about what you stop doing internally. It is the absence of resistance to what is already happening. Nothing more, nothing added. You can still act, decide, speak, and move, but the internal friction, the tightening against the moment, begins to soften. To understand this more clearly, it helps to look at resistance in real time. A situation arises that you don't like. Almost instantly, there is a reaction. This shouldn't be happening. I need to fix this. How do I get out of this? That reaction is resistance, not the situation itself, but the inner opposition to it. Now imagine, just for a moment, that the situation remains exactly the same, but that inner opposition is not there. No mental pushing, no immediate need to change it, just awareness of what is happening. The situation may still be difficult, action may still be required, but something is different. The added layer of tension is gone. This is the beginning of acceptance. Not agreement. Not approval, simply the absence of inner conflict with what already exists. This distinction matters because acceptance is often mistaken for saying, "This is fine," but acceptance does not make that claim. It simply removes the automatic resistance that says, "This should not be." And without that resistance, perception becomes clearer. You can see the situation more directly, respond more appropriately, act without the distortion of tension. In this way, surrender is not a withdrawal from life. It is a more direct engagement with it, because you are no longer reacting to your own resistance on top of what is already happening. A simple metaphor can make this clearer. Imagine falling into water. If you panic and thrash against it, your movements become chaotic. You use more energy, but gain less stability. If, instead, you allow the water to support you, even briefly, your body naturally begins to float. Nothing new has been added. The water was always capable of holding you, but resistance prevented you from experiencing that. In the same way, life is not something you have to fight in order to navigate, but the habit of resistance creates the feeling that you do. Surrender is the moment that fighting pauses, even slightly, and something else becomes possible. At this stage, it's common for the mind to try to turn this into a practice, a technique to apply. How do I surrender right now? How do I accept this situation? But these questions often carry subtle effort, a hidden attempt to achieve a certain state, and that effort can recreate the very tension you're beginning to see through. Instead, it can be more helpful to approach this indirectly, not by trying to surrender, but by noticing resistance. Right here, in this moment, is there any sense of pushing against what is? Any tightening in the body? Any mental argument with reality? You don't need to change it, just notice it, because in the clear seeing of resistance, something begins to relax on its own, not forced, not controlled, like a clenched fist that slowly realizes it doesn't need to stay closed. And as that fist loosens, there is a natural release. This release is what surrender feels like. Ordinary, unremarkable, but noticeably lighter. Situations that once triggered immediate reaction now have space around them. Emotions still arise, but they move more freely. They are felt, without being held in place by resistance. Even difficult experiences become more fluid, not because they are pleasant, but because they are not being opposed. This doesn't mean resistance disappears completely. It may still arise, just as thoughts do, but now, it can be seen, recognized as it happens, and in that recognition, it loses some of its force. You are no longer fully inside it. There is awareness of it, and that awareness is already a form of acceptance, not something you create, but something that is present when resistance is no longer unconscious. From here, the shift continues naturally, not as a goal to reach, but as a gradual unwinding of what was never needed to begin with. And with each moment, that resistance softens. Even slightly, life becomes a little less heavy, a little less complicated, not because anything has been solved, but because something unnecessary is no longer being carried. Chapter 6. Seeing without judgment. As resistance begins to soften, another pattern becomes easier to notice. The habit of judgment, not just obvious opinions or strong reactions, but the constant, subtle labeling of experience, good or bad, right or wrong, better or worse. This happens quickly, often instantly. A situation appears, and almost at the same time, A conclusion forms about it. I like this. I don't like this. This shouldn't be happening. This is exactly what I wanted. These judgments seem harmless, even useful. They appear to help you navigate the world, to make decisions, avoid problems, pursue what matters. But when looked at more closely, something else becomes clear. Judgment doesn't just describe experience, it shapes it. The moment something is labeled, the mind begins to relate to it differently. If it's good, there's a tendency to hold onto it, to extend it, to worrying about losing it. If it's bad, there's a movement away, a desire to fix, avoid, or escape. In both cases, the experience itself becomes secondary. What matters is the label and what it implies. This pulls attention out of direct perception and into mental interpretation. Instead of seeing clearly, you are reacting to your own description of what is happening. This is closely connected to resistance, because judgment often carries an implicit demand that reality should be different than it is. This shouldn't be happening is not just a thought, it is resistance in verbal form, and even positive judgments can create subtle tension. This is good can quickly become, I need this to continue. So the mind stays active, monitoring, maintaining, protecting. Very little is simply allowed to unfold. Seeing without judgment does not mean becoming indifferent. It does not mean losing the ability to distinguish, decide, or respond. It means something much simpler, seeing before the label appears, or noticing the label as it forms, without immediately following it. A sound is heard. Before it becomes annoying or pleasant, it is just a sound. A sensation arises. Before it becomes uncomfortable or nice, it is just a sensation. A situation unfolds. Before it becomes problem or opportunity, it is simply what is happening. This kind of perception is direct, unfiltered, and in that directness, there is a sense of clarity, not because everything is understood, but because nothing extra has been added. At first, this may only happen in brief moments. The label still comes, the reaction still follows, but now, it is seen. You notice the instant. Experience turns into commentary. And in that noticing, there is a small but important shift. You are no longer completely inside the judgment. You are aware of it. This awareness changes the relationship. Judgments lose some of their solidity. They are recognized as mental activity, not as inherent truths about reality. They shouldn't have said that. Is seen as a thought, not as an objective fact. This is going badly. Is seen as an interpretation, not the situation itself. This doesn't stop judgments from appearing, but it softens their authority. They don't need to be believed in the same way. And without that automatic belief, the chain reaction begins to weaken. Less holding on, less pushing away, more space around what is happening. In that space, a different quality of intelligence emerges, not based on analysis or comparison, but on direct perception. You begin to respond to situations as they actually are, not as they have been labeled. This can feel surprisingly simple, almost obvious. A conversation is just a conversation. A delay is just a delay. A feeling is just a feeling. Without the added layer of judgment, experience becomes lighter, more fluid, not because everything is pleasant, but because nothing is being turned into a problem unnecessarily. This is where an important distinction becomes clear. Clarity is not passivity. Seeing without judgment does not mean doing nothing. It means acting without distortion, responding without the extra layer of resistance that comes from labeling reality as wrong. From this place, action can be more precise, more appropriate to the moment, because it is not driven by the need to defend an idea or correct an interpretation. It comes directly from what is seen. As this becomes more familiar, life begins to feel less divided, less categorized into opposing sides that must be managed. There is still contrast, still preference, still choice, but without the constant overlay of judgment. These no longer create the same level of tension. Experience is allowed to move, without being immediately fixed into meaning, and in that movement, there is a quiet sense of ease, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing extra is being added to what is already here. This is the difference between living through interpretation and living through direct perception. And as this difference becomes clearer, the need to judge begins to fall away on its own, not because it is wrong, but because it is no longer necessary, and what remains is a way of seeing that is simple, immediate, and free from the constant effort to turn every moment into something it doesn't need to be, and in that space, something new or perhaps something very old has room to be noticed. Chapter 7. Living in Flow. As judgment softens and resistance becomes more visible, life does not suddenly become different in its structure. The same responsibilities remain, the same conversations happen, the same challenges appear, but the way they are experienced begins to shift. Not dramatically, not permanently at first, but enough to notice. There are moments where action feels less forced, where thinking is not heavy or tangled, where response happens without excessive inner negotiation. These moments are often described as flow. But here, flow is not a special state. It is not something to achieve or maintain. It is what happens when unnecessary resistance is not present. Simple, ordinary, unforced. In daily life, this can appear in very small ways. Answering a message without overthinking it. Starting a task without needing to feel ready first. Speaking without rehearsing every possible outcome. There is still thought, still awareness, still choice, but there is less friction between intention and action, less delay created by internal commentary. You may notice that attention itself becomes more available. Instead of being split between what is happening and what it means, attention rests more fully on the situation itself. When washing dishes, there is just washing dishes. When walking, there is just walking. When listening, there is just listening, not in an exaggerated or mystical sense, but in a simple reduction of mental interference. What changes is not the world, it is the layering on top of the world. At this stage, many people assume something has been gained, a new ability, a new state to preserve. But what is actually happening is often the opposite. Less is being added, less interpretation, less resistance, less effort to manage experience internally. Because of this, decisions can feel clearer, not because more thinking is happening, but because thinking is no longer crowded by unnecessary tension. A decision is seen, and what needs to be done becomes more obvious. Without as much internal argument, action can arise more naturally, not impulsively, but cleanly. This does not mean difficulty disappears. Challenges still appear sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes intensely, but the relationship to them is different. Instead of immediate contraction, there is more space around the experience. A problem is still a problem, but it is not multiplied by resistance. Pain may still arise, but it is not turned into additional psychological struggle. This distinction is important. Flow is not the absence of difficulty. It is the absence of unnecessary struggle with difficulty. Because of this, energy that was previously spent on internal resistance becomes available again, not as excitement or constant positivity, but as clarity and responsiveness. You may find that small things change first. Less procrastination, less overanalysis, less mental rehearsal of conversations that have not happened yet. A quieter mind does not mean an empty mind. It means a mind that is not constantly interfering. Thought still arises, but it is no longer always in charge of experience. It becomes more like a tool than a background condition, something used when needed, not something constantly running in the background. In this way, flow is not something you enter. It is something that appears when interference is reduced, when resistance is not actively shaping each moment, when life is not being continuously erected in real time. At times, this may feel almost unremarkable. You simply notice that things are happening, and there is less strain around them, less internal commentary saying, "This should be different," or "I need to get this right before I can proceed." Instead, there is a kind of allowance, a willingness for things to be as they are, long enough for appropriate action to emerge. This does not remove responsibility. It often clarifies it, because when the noise of resistance quiets, what remains is often simpler than expected. What needs to be done is seen more directly, and what does not need to be done becomes easier to leave alone. Over time, this way of living becomes more familiar, not as a permanent state, but as a reference point, a recognition that experience does not always need to be filtered through tension, and that much of what was once considered necessary effort was actually interference. Still, this is not a final arrival. the mind will continue to generate resistance at times. Old patterns will reappear, habits will resurface, but now they are more easily recognized, and in that recognition, they lose some of their authority. You are less completely inside them. There is awareness alongside them, and that awareness is enough to shift the relationship. So life continues, with its movement, its unpredictability, its demands. But something subtle has changed, not in what life is, but in how it is met. And in that difference, a quieter kind of flow becomes available, not as something to reach, but as something that is noticed, when resistance is not running the show. Chapter 8. Challenges still arise. As the relationship to experience begins to shift, there is often a subtle expectation that life itself will become easier, that problems will lessen, that discomfort will fade, that clarity will replace confusion. But this expectation, while understandable, can become another form of resistance, because life does not stop presenting challenges. It continues, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly, sometimes in ways that feel overwhelming or unfair. Difficult conversations still happen, plans still fall apart, loss, uncertainty, and discomfort still arise. Nothing about the structure of life is removed. What changes is not what appears, but how it is met. In earlier chapters, resistance was described as the tendency to push against what is happening, to mentally argue with reality, to try to replace the present moment with a preferred version of it. Even when this pattern is seen more clearly, it does not disappear completely. Old conditioning remains, reactions still arise, the mind still reaches for control, explanation, and resolution. But there is a difference now. The reactions are more visible, and because they are visible, they are less total. A difficult moment may still trigger frustration. Tension may still appear in the body. Thoughts may still rush in to interpret or fix the situation. But alongside all of that, there is also awareness of it happening. This awareness does not eliminate the experience. It changes the relationship to it. Pain may still be felt, but it is not automatically turned into suffering. This distinction is subtle but important. Pain is the direct experience of difficulty, physical, emotional, or psychological. Suffering is the additional layer of resistance added to that experience. It is the "this should not be happening" woven into the moment. When resistance is strong, these two are inseparable. Pain and suffering merge into one continuous experience. But when resistance is seen more clearly, a space begins to open between them. In that space, something different becomes possible. A difficult emotion can be felt directly, without immediately being turned into a problem. Fear can arise, without becoming a story about the future. Sadness can be present, without being resisted or explained away. This does not make the experience pleasant, but it makes it more bearable, more complete, less fragmented. Life, in this way, becomes more honest, because nothing is being pushed away internally. Even discomfort is allowed to exist, without being immediately corrected. At the same time, challenges continue to require response. Acceptance does not mean inaction. If something needs to be addressed, it can still be addressed. If change is necessary, action can still be taken. The difference is that action is no longer driven by the urgency of resistance alone. It becomes more responsive than reactive, clearer, less distorted by panic or avoidance. For example, in a stressful situation, the usual pattern might be immediate mental escalation. This is bad. I can't handle this. I need to fix this right now. That escalation tightens perception. It narrows attention. It increases urgency. But when there is more awareness, that same situation may still be stressful, but the escalation is seen as it happens, and in being seen, it loses some of its momentum. There is still energy present, but less compulsion, more space to respond appropriately, rather than react automatically. This is not a perfected state. It is not a constant calm or emotional neutrality. Life still moves. Emotion still moves. Thought still moves. What changes is the degree of identification with those movements. You are no longer entirely absorbed in them. There is awareness alongside them, and that awareness creates room. Room for choice. Room for clarity. Room for presence even in difficulty. Over time, this begins to change how challenges are experienced overall, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer multiplied by inner opposition. A difficult moment is still a difficult moment, but it is not endlessly extended in the mind. It is not continuously replayed, resisted, or reinterpreted. It arises, it is met, it passes, and in that simple movement, something becomes noticeable. Life was never asking to be perfectly controlled. It was only ever unfolding, and much of the struggle came not from life itself, but from the effort to stand against that unfolding. When that effort is seen more clearly, even if it still arises at times, its authority weakens, and what remains is a different kind of relationship with difficulty. Not avoidance, not denial, but presence, and presence, even in challenge, changes everything, not by removing what is difficult, but by no longer adding to it. Chapter 9. Integration into Daily Life. At this point, the question naturally shifts, not what is resistance, or what is surrender, but something more practical. What does this actually look like in everyday life? Because insight, by itself, is not the point. It has to meet real situations, work, relationships, decisions, stress, routine. Otherwise, it remains abstract. Integration is where perception is tested, not in isolated moments of clarity, but in ordinary, repeated circumstances, the kind that make up most of a life. You may still wake up with thoughts already moving, planning, remembering, anticipating. That does not disappear. But now, there can be a slight difference in how it is met. Instead of immediately following every thought, there is a small space of recognition. This is happening in the mind, not as rejection, not as control, just recognition. And in that recognition, there is less compulsion to obey every mental movement. In daily life, this might look very ordinary. You notice tension while checking emails. You feel the urge to rush a decision. You catch yourself rehearsing a conversation that hasn't happened yet. Previously, these patterns would carry you almost completely. Now, they are more often seen while they are happening, and that changes the experience. Not because the patterns vanish, but because they are no longer fully unconscious. One simple way this begins to integrate is through pauses, not forced pauses, but natural moments of noticing, before responding, before reacting, before concluding, a brief recognition that experience is unfolding, without needing immediate interpretation. In that small gap, reaction is not eliminated, but it is no longer automatic. This can be practiced in very ordinary ways. For example, during conversation, you might notice the impulse to interrupt, defend, or correct. Instead of acting immediately on that impulse, there is a moment of seeing it, and sometimes that is enough for a different response to arise naturally, not a controlled response, a simpler one, less driven by internal pressure. In work, this might show up as reduced mental clutter. A task appears, and instead of immediately layering it with stress or overanalysis, it is approached more directly. What actually needs to be done becomes clearer. When it is not being constantly filtered through worrying, even difficult or complex tasks become more manageable. When resistance is not constantly amplifying them. In relationships, integration often shows up as listening, not listening while preparing a response, but listening as a full experience, hearing what is being said, without immediately turning it into a position or defense. This kind of listening is simple, but not always easy, because the habit of self-reference is strong. What does this mean for me? How should I respond? Am I being seen correctly? These questions often arise automatically, but they can also be noticed, and in being noticed, they lose some of their grip. There is more room to actually hear the other person, without immediate internal commentary. Over time, these small moments accumulate, not into a dramatic transformation, but into a different baseline. Less tension in ordinary situations, less urgency in decision-making, less mental noise surrounding simple actions. Importantly, this is not a state of constant calm. Life still contains stress, uncertainty, and pressure. The difference is that these experiences are less likely to be multiplied by internal resistance. A busy day is still a busy day, but it is not necessarily an internally chaotic one. There is movement, but less friction. One key aspect of integration is remembering that nothing needs to be perfect. The mind will still generate old patterns, judgment will still arise, resistance will still appear, The difference is that they are more easily recognized when they do, and recognition, even brief, is enough to interrupt full identification. This is not about maintaining a new identity, as someone who is aware, that would simply replace one structure with another. Instead, it is more fluid than that. Sometimes awareness is clear, sometimes it is not, sometimes reactions are seen, sometimes they are followed without noticing. Integration is not about eliminating fluctuation, it is about shortening the time it takes to recognize what is happening. And in that shortening, life begins to feel less heavy, not because it has changed shape, but because it is no longer constantly being added to. There is also a practical simplicity that develops. Less need to over-prepare, less need to mentally simulate every outcome, less need to secure certainty before acting. Action becomes more direct, not careless, but less burdened. This makes room for responsiveness, to adjust when needed, to learn as things unfold, to correct course without excessive self-judgment. Gradually, life becomes more workable, not because problems disappear, but because they are not continuously amplified internally. And in that shift, a quiet confidence can appear, not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in presence itself, in the ability to meet what is here, without being completely consumed by resistance to it. This is integration, not a final state, but a lived adjustment in how experience is met, moment by moment, situation by situation, without needing it to be otherwise. Chapter 10. The ongoing journey. At some point, the mind may try to turn everything that has been seen into a destination, a place to arrive, a state to maintain, a final version of experience where resistance no longer appears. But that idea, however appealing, misunderstands what has been unfolding. There is no final moment where life becomes permanently free of challenge, thought, or reaction. There is no endpoint where awareness locks into place and never moves again. What has been discovered is not an achievement, it is a way of seeing, and seeing does not stand still. It continues to meet whatever arises, sometimes clearly, sometimes not, sometimes opally, sometimes through the filters of old patterns. Nothing about this is fixed. Even moments of deep clarity are temporary. They appear, they pass, and what remains is the capacity to notice both. This is why the idea of arrival is so subtle, because the mind wants certainty. It wants something it can hold on to, something that says, this is it, it is done. But life does not offer that kind of completion. It offers movement, change, uncertainty, return. Again and again, experience unfolds, and again, perception meets it, sometimes with resistance, sometimes without it. The difference is not in eliminating one and preserving the other. It is in the growing ability to recognize what is happening, while it is happening, not after the fact, not as analysis, but in real time, more often than before. This recognition is not dramatic. It does not feel like progress in the usual sense. In fact, it often feels like something very ordinary. A moment of noticing tension in the body, a pause before reacting, a brief awareness of a thought forming, a softening of urgency that was previously automatic. These are not special experiences. They are simple moments of clarity within everyday life. And over time, they begin to change the texture of living, not by removing difficulty, but by reducing unnecessary struggle with it. Life continues to include uncertainty. Plans still change, emotions still arise, situations still unfold in unexpected ways, but the relationship to all of this becomes less adversarial, less defined by the need to control or direct experience itself. There is more willingness to let things be seen as they are, before immediately turning them into something to fix. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean disengagement. It means responding from what is actually present, rather than from accumulated resistance to it. And because of that, action can become more natural, less burdened by internal conflict, more aligned with the situation as it is, not as it is imagined to be. Still, old patterns will return. They return because they are familiar, because they have been practiced for a long time. A moment of stress may bring back contraction. A difficult interaction may trigger defensiveness. Uncertainty may generate urgency. This is not a failure. It is simply conditioning appearing again. And now, it can be seen more quickly, sometimes immediately, sometimes only afterward. but even seeing it afterward is part of the process, because each time it is recognized, the identification with it weakens slightly, not permanently, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Over time, what changes is not the presence of resistance in life, but the belief that it must define experience. There is more space around it, more context, more awareness alongside it, and in that space, something very simple becomes noticeable. You are not the resistance. You are not the thought. You are not the reaction. These are movements within experience, appearing and disappearing. What you are cannot be fully captured by them. It is the knowing of them, the space in which they occur. This is not something to believe. It is something to notice, again and again, in ordinary moments. As life continues, so the journey does not end. It keeps unfolding, not toward completion, but toward greater familiarity with what is already here. Clarity comes and goes. Resistance comes and goes. Understanding comes and goes. And through it all, life continues to present itself, not as a problem to solve once and for all, but as an ongoing opportunity to see more clearly. And perhaps that is what was always meant, not an arrival, but a deepening recognition that nothing essential was ever missing, only overlooked, in the movement of trying to become something else, and in the quiet moments of seeing that clearly. The search itself begins to soften, not because it has found an end, but because it is no longer necessary to go anywhere else in order to meet what is already here. Conclusion: what remains when nothing is being added? If there is anything this exploration has pointed to, it is not a new belief, a new system, or a new way of becoming someone better. It has been something far simpler than that, a way of noticing what is already happening. Over and over again, we return to the same movement in experience, the subtle leaning away from what is here, and the quiet effort to make it different. This movement has many names: resistance, judgment, identity, control, but underneath all of them, it is the same pattern, a constant addition to experience, that turns what is simple into something heavy. And because it is so familiar, it is rarely questioned. It feels like normal life. It feels like me. But, as it is seen more clearly, even in brief moments, something begins to change. Not the content of life, but the way it is held, the way it is met. What once felt like immediate reaction begins to reveal itself as movement. What once felt like certainty begins to reveal itself as interpretation. What once felt like this is just how things are begins to reveal itself as a pattern of seeing. And in that recognition, something softens, not because anything is forced to stop, but because less is unconsciously added. This is the quiet transformation at the center of everything you have moved through here. Not arrival, not perfection, not escape, but reduction. Less interference, less automatic resistance, less unnecessary commentary shaping each moment. And with that reduction, experience becomes more direct, not always easier, not always comfortable, but more honest, more immediate, more alive in its simplicity. Life still happens, thought still arises, emotion still moves, challenges still appear, but there is less belief that any of it needs to be fundamentally opposed in order to be lived. And in that subtle shift, something important is revealed. You are not separate from experience in the way it often seems. You are not standing outside of life, trying to manage it correctly. You are the space in which it is happening, and when that space is not constantly filled with resistance, everything is simply seen more clearly, not controlled more tightly, seen more clearly. That clarity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is often quiet, almost unremarkable, a moment of noticing tension instead of being lost in it, a pause before reacting, a recognition that a thought is just a thought, a brief relaxation into what is already here. These are not achievements. They are glimpses of what is always available, when nothing extra is being added. And perhaps that is the simplest way to understand everything explored in this work. Nothing new is being created. Only the unnecessary is being seen for what it is. And as that seeing deepens, even slowly, even imperfectly, life is no longer experienced as something to constantly resist or correct. It becomes something to meet, directly, moment by moment, without needing it to be otherwise. And in that meeting, simple, ordinary, unforced, what remains is not a final answer, but a living clarity. that continues to unfold, as long as there is willingness to see.